Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. It all begins in the kingdom of Dune. A man named Baranobus Dune II, who was just the ruler of this kingdom, sat in his office and thought. The rebellion family was in dire straits but never recovered. He was especially annoyed by this girl from the Lux family named Ophelia. His assistant, who was standing nearby, asked, "Is he really talking about the silver heroine?" And then laughing said, "A woman certainly can't be a strong warrior." Still, Baranobus said he cannot turn a blind eye and must take action. He was about to tie her to him in order to keep a close eye on her. But then he suddenly heard laughter from his partner and ended up laughing himself as well. At this time in the Verdette military camp, a girl named Ophelia Lux, who was the commander of the 3rd Squad of Royal Knights, was sitting in her tent. Suddenly, as always in the evening, the mail arrived. When she saw to whom the letter was addressed, she sighed heavily and thought that she should not have expected this. But at that moment, a guy named Leopold Arthur suddenly walked into her tent. He was the commander of the 2nd Squad of the Royal Knights. The boy was holding a bottle of good liquor. And then seeing the letter and Ophelia's sad face, he wondered what had happened there. When he saw the seal, he took it in his hands and asked, "Are these really orders from the king?" He also asked what reward they were promising this time. However, without even waiting for the girl's permission, he opened the letter and said he would read it and find out everything for himself. But as soon as Leopold saw the contents, he was furious and called the man an idiot. Ophelia, for her part, was calmly polishing her weapon and paid no attention to him. Then the man, seeing no reaction from her, turned around and asked in surprise, "Does she really not care about this at all?" Seeing her indifferent face again, he started yelling, saying that if you put it that way, she was actually in huge trouble. But Ophelia replied in a perfectly calm voice that she knew all this perfectly well and needed no further reminder. Leopold was still very surprised and wondered why then she was so calm. Does she really want to become queen, as the king asks her to do? The girl in turn wondered, is he really crazy? Since he can assume such a thing, she also asked, why would she agree to be engaged to this mad tyrant? Especially since the girl didn't even know what his intentions might be. After all, they had never crossed paths before, and then suddenly such an offer came at once. In fact, King Baranobus has ruled the state for 23 years. His subjects have always suffered from exorbitant taxes and poor harvests, and thus, in despair, they simply died. And despite the massive loss of population, the king continued to pursue self-interest by destroying the aristocrats' own proprietors. And during his reign, he has already become famous as a tyrant. But so far, no one has had the strength to deal with his huge army and overthrow him from the throne. Now and then, flaring up rebellions were suppressed, and the protracted war still continued on the continent. Leopold, after pondering for a while, turned to the girl and said that he only wanted to make her queen to keep her under his watch after all. Ophelia said in a very serious voice that they could end the war, and if they had money, they could even help the people. They are like an eyesore to the king, and he will never leave them alone. And a man for whom women are mere puppets is unlikely to be sincere in his desire to marry her because of his exorbitant feelings. So, as Leopold said, he just wants to either control her or win her over to his side. Ophelia understood that very well. Then the man said that she was right, because she also had great influence among the soldiers. And because of this, the king is very worried. But he doesn't have a good enough reason to deprive her of her position or send her into retirement. That's why he decided to come up with some kind of plan. Leopold began to walk around the tent from side to side and wondered what they should do. After all, because he had a lot of power, he might not accept her rejection. Ophelia was silent for a while, and then said that she had one very risky idea after all. The guy immediately looked at her and asked her what the idea was. But the girl, sighing heavily, said she wasn't going to tell him that. And seeing his surprised look, she explained that she wasn't going to say it because he would definitely freak out. Leopold was already angry and said that since she wouldn't tell him for that reason, it was clearly something completely reckless. But she, smiling, told him not to worry, for if everything as she thought it would happen, she could certainly succeed and make all her goals a reality. And so, a few days later, Ophelia traveled with her troop to the royal palace, for she had been summoned there. People, when they saw them on the streets, immediately started cheering and applauding them. Having won the great battle, the girl was warmly welcomed by the people. Everyone gave her some small gifts and thanked her for this victory. And soon, when word reached Baranobus that she had received a rather warm welcome, he was very displeased. His assistant said that this woman had a very good reputation, and if she became queen, it would only be to his advantage. The man, upon reflection, said that he certainly knew that himself, for otherwise he would have been a complete lunatic to invite her to this place. And he himself at this moment could not understand why these lowlifes were praising this incomprehensible ordinary woman right in front of him. He was so angry that he even dropped his wine glass, shattering it with all his might. After that, the guy turned around and started to walk away. He returned to his throne room and sat in his chair as he suddenly heard the butler's voice saying that Countess Ophelia Lux had arrived. The man didn't even get up to say hello to her, only looked at her with distrust and some caution. For a while they were all silent. Then Ophelia took a few steps closer and knelt to greet the man. She said in a loud voice that she was the commander of the 3rd Night Squad and welcomed His Highness the Great Dune King. Baranobus, when he heard her voice, was very much surprised, for it was very much like a man's, and the lad was already doubting over how such a person could be made his queen. But then suddenly, he put a smile on his face and said that they were finally seeing each other, and he was insanely happy to see them. He also added, complimenting her, that the silver heroine that everyone talked about so often was indeed insanely beautiful. And at that moment, they suddenly heard the other knights who were present in the hall talking. They didn't understand how on earth they could compliment this girl, since she was so masculine. Someone explained to the man that it was part of etiquette. However, he still thought it was too much. Ophelia then said that his letter was talking about a reward, and added that she really wished for something. The man was a little surprised, but at the same time wary. He looked at her and asked what exactly she wanted. The girl said that she actually has a man she just admires since her days at the academy many years ago, so she really wants him to give her Prince Aiden. When Baranobus heard this, he was overjoyed and asked, did she really want a prince? His assistant, when he heard this, was also very surprised, as were all the other people who were present in the room at the time. The ladies did not understand how on earth she could ask for it is usually the man who asks for the woman's hand, not the other way around. However, the king himself laughed at that moment, and said that her devotion was very impressive. To love unrequitedly for so many years in a row is a strong willpower. People began to talk, not understanding how she could ask the king like that. But others said that she must be afraid of him too, because he was a tyrant. So she had decided to make her own terms. Ophelia, for her part, continued to sit still. The man was thinking about what to say to her, and she didn't know what he would do. Baranobus thought seriously, and realized that such a chance would be a good opportunity to take control of her without elevating her to queen. So, after thinking for a while, he smiled evilly, and said that he had agreed to her terms after all, and could give her Aiden. However, he also had one condition. If she started running away from home to the battlefield, his little brother would be contentedly lonely. And besides, something unforeseen and irreparable might happen to her there, and then he would be a widower altogether. So Baranobus asked the girl to leave the service and live as an ordinary woman. In return, he could give her the territories south of the capital. Ophelia, hearing this, was very surprised. The man said she could consider it a wedding present. She pondered for a while, then said in a trembling voice that she would do as he said. The man, upon hearing this answer, suddenly laughed very loudly and asked, "Is her love for Aiden so great that she is even willing to give up her life's work?" This really surprised him very much indeed. He still gave her his word, however, and said that in that case, she could take him away. In fact, Baranobus gave the prince away so easily because he was able to recruit him to his side, and now he is simply his loyal dog. The man smiled smugly and thought that he was very lucky after all. Ophelia, for her part, bowed once more and thanked His Highness for that. But of course, the girl had her own backup plan, and she knew that the king was satisfied that everything was going as he had planned. But he would not have to indulge this illusion for long. When evening came, Baranobus was sitting in his bedroom in his pajamas, and suddenly summoned the prince to him to tell him the news. Aiden came to him rather quickly and inquired if he had summoned him. The man was still in uniform, for he had just arrived. In fact, the king was going to marry his brother to the daughter of a rich and loyal duke, but he liked it that way even much better, for the man would now be able to make the most of his abilities. So he turned to the prince and told him to get married. Aiden was surprised when he heard this and asked what he was talking about. Baranobus, in turn, said that the countess he wanted to make queen had liked him very much since his days at the academy, so she asked for his hand in marriage. When the prince heard this, he inquired, "Is it really about Countess Lux?" His brother, in turn, said that everything was right, and for him it was quite surprising that such a woman could fall in love, and even kept faithful to his beloved for many years in a row. Aiden stepped closer to him and turned to his highness, wondering if he thought it was too much of a surprise. But the latter set the glass of liquor down with a loud clatter on the table, and looking at his brother with an angry look, inquired, "Does he really want to give it up in his position?" The prince at this point put his head down and began to casually recall those moments from his childhood when his older brother used to beat him up all the time for daring to cross him. Baranobus, when he was still quite young, after beating his younger brother once again, gave him the advice that if he wanted to survive, he had better stay out of any business at all. So now Aiden, in a trembling voice, simply said that he would do whatever the king ordered. Baranobus smiled smugly and told him to marry in turn and watch this girl. If he noticed anything, he would report to him immediately. Then the boy asked if that was all there was to it, and the brother said that there were also rumors that some fools were planning another uprising, and there are some aristocrats among them as well. Aiden, hearing this, looked at him in surprise and asked, "Does he really suspect this particular woman?" Baranobus said that she is, after all, the daughter of the Lux family, and asked if the boy knew how her parents died, and to his great regret, for lack of evidence, he could not get rid of the whole family. Taking another glass of liquor, he said that once she was married, various aristocrats would gather around her, and he was going to sway them to his side. Baranobus, smiling, said that in case things didn't work out, he needed proof of her guilt, and it was the prince's job to get that dirt for him. Aiden, of course, didn't like that decision, but he said he'd do it. He felt incredibly sorry for the girl, but the king had already made his decision, and he dared not disobey it. The man in turn smiled, and said that he was a good boy after all. Finally, he also added that it would be good for them to have a child, so she would be much more obedient. He smiled smugly and said that everything would happen just like it did in his family. After all, his mother had also had a child in good time. Aiden didn't say anything, just stared coldly in his direction. In fact, he was overcome with anger and hatred, but he didn't show it. Baranobus, when he noticed this, said that just a few years ago he couldn't hide his emotions, but now he wasn't even interested in teasing him. So he disappointedly told the guy to leave already. He also told his brother that they would play the wedding as soon as the girl was demobilized. The prince left his office and went to his room with quick steps. He passed by the maids who were just cleaning up and suddenly felt their eyes on him. That made him very angry too. But soon, when he went into his office, he slammed the doors behind him, and unable to bear the emotion, struck his fist so hard on the desk that a glass even fell from there and shattered. Aiden's hand was bleeding, and he kept mentally cursing his older brother, calling him an idiot. What irritated and offended the man the most was that he was still blackening his mother's name, but after a while he was able to calm down a little, and smiling, he thought about the girl who had asked him to marry her. He assumed she was crazy to do such a thing. Some time has passed since then, and Ophelia has finally returned from the battlefield with a huge carriage of suitcases to her parental home. She was immediately greeted by the maid and butler. She immediately ran up and said that their lady had finally returned. However, the butler said, "Madame Duncan, it's not good to call her just lady. We're talking about the head of the family." This maid, who was also Ophelia's nanny, told him not to be so nerdy. For what was far more important now was that after 4 months, their lady was finally back. Ophelia, for her part, finally did get out of the carriage, and, holding out her arms for a hug, I said hello to my nanny and butler, who had come out to meet her. The maid immediately ran up to her and began to hug her tightly, saying that it was an incredible blessing that she was alive and well. Ophelia even blushed a little with happiness and embarrassment. And then she said that her nanny hadn't changed at all since she was still very young, always believing in her. After that, the girl shifted her gaze to the butler, who was standing modestly to the side, and said that she was happy to see him too. The man bowed as well, and said that he was glad to see her back. But then suddenly the nanny finally got off Ophelia's back and suggested she go inside, since Marco had so much prepared for her arrival. The girl was very excited about it, and said she couldn't wait to try it. Soon they went inside, and the first thing they did was to go to the canteen to have lunch. Ophelia, when she took the first bite of food into her mouth, she said it was incredibly delicious. She just ate for a while. After that, she decided to tell her news after all. So, addressing all the servants who were present, she said she was going to demobilize. When Nanny heard this, she was more surprised than anyone else. The butler and the cook named Marco still reacted normally. The woman ran up to Ophelia and asked why it was that she had suddenly made such a decision. Was she really hurt so badly? The girl immediately tried to reassure her and said that she was absolutely fine. But she explained her demobilization by saying that she was going to get married, and in saying these words, she smiled. I hope to close this messy situation as soon as possible. The nanny was even more surprised to hear this, and the cook in turn objected, My lady, saying that Shivitya did not even have any fiancé, so what marriage can even talk about he does not understand. The nanny, who had attacked Ophelia, could not understand if this was true. Then the butler turned to Madame Dansant and said that she was the head of the family and asked her to have some respect. And when the girl finally did move away from Ophelia, he inquired if he was correct in thinking that her chosen one was Leopold. The girl, in turn, averted her gaze and wondered why they suddenly thought it would be him. But Nanny, surprised, wondered if it would not be Mr. Leo, who in that case, for she had hardly ever spoken to anyone so intimately. Ophelia got a little embarrassed, and then, with her head down, said that it would be the prince. Nanny at once glowed with joy, and inquired what country this prince would be from. And then, asked they, will it really be Prince Aidan from their country? Ophelia, who was shaking because the maid was holding her so tightly, said that of course it would be him, since the second prince was only 5 years old. The nanny said it was fine, for he was the chief handsome man of the kingdom, and their young ladies only talked about how excellent his manners were. The girl at this point mentally apologized to her, for after all, this was not going to be the romantic story she would so much like to hear. But then suddenly the nanny really suspected something and said that they didn't realize she was visiting the prince after all. Ophelia said that of course she hadn't visited him, since she didn't even know his face. When all the servants heard this, they were very surprised and could not even say a word. The girl, in turn, just kept eating. Ophelia quickly got up from the table and said that this was the way things were, and she had no power to change anything. She also said that she would return immediately after her demobilization, so they asked that her room be prepared for her. Nanny tearfully turned to my lady and asked why she had not told them such important news sooner. The butler suddenly started yelling at the nanny, asking who she even thought she was. You see, the lady is an aristocrat and they are mere servants. At this point, Ophelia came closer to them and hugged them, saying that she would tell them everything, but a little later, so they shouldn't be upset. But for now they just needed to know that they had their reasons. When she put Nanny at the table, telling them to sit down too, for it would be quite cold by now. Soon she didn't want them to eat cold. The next morning Leopold immediately burst in on Ophelia with loud shouts and anger. The girl, who was still asleep, looked at him in surprise and asked him what he had such an urgent matter to attend to early in the morning. He didn't even let her sleep, and he, in turn, came closer to her and asked in a surprised voice, Are the rumors true, and is she getting married? He was so angry that he even came very close to her and slapped his hand on the couch behind her. The girl sighed heavily, and then she said that in their vast country the mouths of the nobles spread openings faster than messengers on horseback, and it turns out that this news has apparently already reached the front. Leopold was so angry he didn't even want to answer these stupid questions. For a while he looked at her. Ophelia just smiled. When the man covered his face with his hand and said that apparently it was all really true and she was getting married, the The girl replied that it just so happened and wondered, is that really the only reason he came this far? The man did not want to answer her questions and asked, is it true about the demobilization too? She said it was true, because those were the conditions. Leopold inquired, how on earth could she choose a prince over a king, for she had never even seen his face? Ophelia herself was getting angry, not understanding why he was attacking her, and asked, what's wrong with you? Leopold in turn calmed down a bit and asked, what are you thinking about? When the girl said something about Princess Regina, the man looked at her in surprise and asked, what does this girl have to do with it? Ophelia said it was all because she wanted it. Princess Regina was Prince Aiden's own older sister, and when Leopold heard about it, he was very surprised and couldn't believe that she really wanted to marry Prince Aiden. The girl looked away and said it was something like that. But the man immediately noticed her habit of looking away and blushing when she was hiding something, so he knew it wasn't the whole truth. When they were silent after that, the man sighed heavily and realized that he was going to have to go to the extreme after all. Leopold got down on one knee and turned to her and inquired what she was hiding and asked, can't you even tell me about it? Ophelia just stood there looking at him for a while. She had thought he wanted to propose to her, but luckily he didn't. But she didn't want to explain anything either. And for a while longer the man stood like that, then sighed, turned around and started to walk away, saying that she might not tell, but would tell as soon as she was able and willing to do so. The girl, seeing his sad face, wondered, is he really mad at me? But the latter, with a glimpse, inquired, why would he do that? After all, the princess has always been cautious, so she has only initiated her plan to its participants. Leopold also said that he wasn't going to pry it out of her how the wedding to the prince had anything to do with what he and she were up to. Ophelia immediately smiled and thanked him sincerely for his understanding and patience. He was still very angry. He tried to keep his emotions in check, however, and sat down across from her and wondered what she was going to do now. The girl sat down as well and started pulling out a snack, wondering what she even had left to eat. The man explained his position by saying that the prince is quite famous in social circles, so she will have to make a lot of efforts. Ophelia took her turn throwing a grain of food into her mouth and said that she had heard, for even Nanny was talking about how handsome he was. She then tossed the grain to her friend, who in turn told her to just not fall in love with him. The girl smiled and said that he knew that she was in no danger of that, because she had no relationships and was surrounded by soldiers all the time. So there was no romance in her life at all. Leopold then smiled and said that since he was Princess Regina's own brother, he must be the most handsome, and so all the ladies would definitely be jealous when they saw them together. Ophelia then asked, does he really think that only lady after all mistress will also be picked on for sure? The man looked at her in surprise and asked, why would they even do that? The girl explained her position by saying that she was Lanka's husband and had somehow managed to win the handsome prince for herself. She said, smiling, that she wasn't much of a lady after all, so there would be a lot of questions. Leopold suddenly became angry and wondered who had said she was a masculine woman, and where did she even get that idea from? But before Ophelia could answer, she suddenly heard someone's voice. It was Regina. She came into the room and said that only people with inferiority complexes said such things. The two of them immediately turned in her direction and were very surprised to see the girl. Regina, forgetting her manners, immediately ran up to her, and hugging her tightly said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other, and she had missed her so much. Ophelia got a little embarrassed and wondered what about their difference in status. Shouldn't she follow the norms? Regina wondered who cared about that now. It wasn't the first or second time they'd seen each other, and they'd been friends for 18 years. And she still dared to play hard to get. At that moment, Regina suddenly turned her attention to the man who had been standing stunned silent all this time. She said, smiling, that apparently Knight Leopold was here as well and also greeted him. The man, in turn, observing all the norms of etiquette, got down on one knee and, kissing her hand, said that he saluted Her Highness the Princess. The girl, with a smile on her face, then said that she really hoped he wasn't too worried. She then sat down on the couch and also said that she had heard everything. It was rather suspicious that her brother was giving in to Ophelia so easily to Aiden. Regina looked away and said that this serpent must have ordered him to do something. He certainly wouldn't just let him go. Ophelia, sitting down beside her, said that she thought the king's main purpose was to deprive her of her influence among the soldiers. Regina looked at her with a puzzled look and said that they didn't really know how it was. Perhaps the king was guessing at their plot. She ignored everything her friend said and also said that he would most likely control Aiden's every move, and she even felt sorry for her brother. Regina decided to change the subject a bit and turned to Ophelia and asked if she was really going to marry him. The girl felt a little uncomfortable about it, but she said it was the only way out, so she couldn't refuse. The friend suddenly giggled and said that in that case they would become even closer, and even relatives, so she was absolutely fine with everything. Leopold, who was standing not far from them, felt like a third extra, for he couldn't even get a word in edgewise. But then suddenly Regina replied that she couldn't see the joy on her face. Ophelia said that of course she was glad. After all, they would become even closer and see each other more often. But then she voiced her doubts, saying that she had never even seen him in her eyes, so she couldn't feel anything about it, only wanting to fulfill those wishes of Regina's and get the prince out of that place. When Leopold heard this, he was very surprised and didn't even bother to hide his surprise on his face. When Regina noticed this, she immediately smiled and turned to him and asked him what he thought about it. The man was a little confused, and then said he wasn't sure this marriage was so necessary. But when the guy saw how intently the princess was looking at him, he immediately told them to forget it. Since it was his and Ophelia's decision, it was probably the right thing to do. The girl didn't even begin to feel sorry for him. Infected thickly, nothing can. Regina suddenly stood up and said that in that case she would go already. Ophelia looked at her friend in surprise and asked why she was leaving so early. After all, she had just recently arrived. However, the girl smiled and said that she just wanted to kill her. After all, 4 months had passed, and she decided to have a thorough talk a little later. She put her hand on her friend's shoulder and smiled, saying it was an incredible blessing that she was okay, because she had been so worried all this time. Ophelia smiled as well. It was really nice to meet an old friend, and she said she would walk her out. "Well, Regina," she laughed, "that you shouldn't do that. After all, there's someone already waiting for you out there," she added in a mysterious voice. "It's my new toy." A friend laughed and said she had an incredibly terrible hobby and would never understand it. "Well, Regina," she said before leaving, "I don't care about that." And then as she said goodbye, she added, "I'll see you at the wedding." Ophelia smiled and said goodbye to her friend, and Leopold in turn stood back and was very sad. Then he suddenly turned around, took his coat, and started to leave. When the girl saw this, she was very surprised and asked him why he was so early, because he would have rested first and then left. However, the guy didn't reply anything to that, but just stupidly started smiling and even blushed a little. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked why he made such an expression, but the boy was silent for a while, and then wondered if she even knew what kind of dirty rumors would start if someone found out he'd been spending time alone with another man's fiancée. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised. For a while she just looked at him, and then asked him what kind of nonsense he was talking about, because he didn't even see her as a woman. He grinned at this point and rubbed her head, tangling Ophelia's hair. She didn't like that very much, so she stepped hard on his foot in protest and revenge. Then he became more serious and said goodbye, saying that in that case they would see each other at her demobilization, and the ceremony was very soon. The girl hugged him goodbye and wished him to be careful on the way back, and said she was already looking forward to seeing them again. And so a few days had passed since then. The time had finally come for Ophelia's solemn send-off to their troupe. It was a rather lavish and solemn ceremony. A multitude of knights gathered in beautiful uniforms and lined everything up to escort the girl with honor. Ophelia was also in uniform and looked simply stunning. Her hair was perfectly styled, and the blue color matched her eyes perfectly. Leopold, who was standing in the midst of the crowd, looked at her for some time without taking his eyes off her. But as soon as she passed, he looked away. Many began to whisper that it would be better for the girl to marry the king instead of the prince, because it is much more profitable. And the other guy said it was too stupid to claim the title of queen with such manners. He remembers when she was popular at the academy, but now she's just some man, and she missed her chance to take a seat next to the king. They even felt sorry for the prince, because her appearance certainly could not excite anyone. When Leopold heard all this, He was so angry that he could not even contain his emotions. He suddenly grabbed one of the guys by his uniform and told Night Beaver to be as careful as possible with his words. He immediately started to get indignant and asked what he had said, but the guy looked quite threatening, and he immediately shut up, afraid that he would be punished. Then suddenly Ophelia came up to them and asked what they were going on about and why they had decided to fight right at the farewell ceremony. Leopold immediately let the guy go and said they didn't have anything special going on here, so she could just ignore it. He then took the girl by the hand and, taking her aside, said that as a future member of the royal family, it would be better for her to be with people like that, so they had better go elsewhere. Ophelia was very surprised, but at the same time she was pleased at the same time, because he was showing his concern in such a way. They were actually the best of friends, and even though they sometimes had some arguments, they were still always together. Before heavy battles, Ophelia loved to get drunk with him, and when he was wounded, she always treated his wounds. When they came to a quieter place, he stopped and said that it was much better here, bigger, since she wasn't a knight commander, so status must be honored. Ophelia thought about it for a bit, and said that was indeed true. Then the man replied that he was still her faithful friend anyway, so she could call him on any occasion if she had anything going on. The girl, on hearing this, was very much surprised, and then inquired derisively when he had had time to become so reliable. The man was outraged and slapped her in retaliation, and she tripped him up afterward, asking how he could hit her like that right in front of the soldiers. The man smiled at her, and then told her not to get attached to the prince and fall in love with him at first sight. Ophelia was indignant and said that she had no intention of doing that at all. When it was over, she would divorce him immediately. Leopold smiled and said that in that case it was fine with him. The girl also smiled. She was really grateful to him, so she said to him, "Thank you." But at that moment the other knights ran up to her, calling her commander, and began to thank her for everything, adding that they respected her immensely and were proud to have been on her team. When the girl saw them, she smiled and thought about the fact that even her best fighters had come to support and thank her. It is actually quite hard to get recognized in the army. However, they did not ignore her just because she was a woman, so now she said she was very happy to work with them and wished that they would take care of themselves and never give up. Ophelia said goodbye to them and then left. Leopold also accompanied her to the carriage, where she also said goodbye to him and then left for her new future. At this time, Prince Aidan was also riding in a carriage somewhere and kept going over in his head the words of his brother, who asked for a guy to follow the girl. Yes, the thing that disappointed and shattered him the most was the word that it would be best for them to have a child. He didn't understand how his brother could even say such a thing, but he decided not to dwell on it. The boy suggested that perhaps it was all for the best. At least he had a chance to escape from this palace, which reminded him of hell. At that moment he was approached by the coachman, who told His Highness that they would be arriving quite soon. The boy replied that he understood. He also reflected on the fact that even though he wanted to escape, the escort services had sent them to keep an eye on him and his behavior anyway. And this silver-haired heroine also frightened him. He wondered what kind of woman would dare to go against the king himself, and to make her own terms with him. By then, Ophelia had already returned to the palace and had time to change her clothes. She thought that the first step had already been taken. They had forced the prince to leave the palace. At that moment, the girl remembered Regina's words, asking that she not tell Aidan that she was the one who had begged to get him out of that place. She explained that she and he weren't on the best of terms, so he'd probably be angry if he found out. After all, she had turned her back on him in order to get away from Baranobus. And about the coup, she also asked the girl not to say anything, for she must in no way reveal herself, because no one knows what may happen. Regina knew full well that Baranobus was treating Aidan as his henchman, because he had successfully brainwashed him to subjugate him completely to himself. So now Ophelia realized that the true reason for this marriage should not be told to the guy in any way. But then suddenly she became wary and blushed all over, because she supposed that he might think she was really in love with him and had a strong feeling against which she could not go. But she quickly pushed those thoughts away, realizing there was nothing she could do about it. She hoped that he wouldn't do anything that could be punished. Then she saw some strange movements in the window and at the same second the nanny came in to tell her that the prince had already arrived. Ophelia replied that she was on her way, and on her way out the door, she thought about the fact that many people said he was the first handsome man of the kingdom, and suggested that he would be about the same appearance as Leopold. But she quickly stopped herself from these musings, and thinking that she shouldn't be making all these theories. For now she would see him, and find out everything for herself. And in a short time, the girl went downstairs. The maid and many other servants were already waiting for her outside, and the nurse said, "My lady," that the prince had already gone to her study. And smiling, Nanny said that she never imagined she would one day have to meet such an incredibly handsome man. Ophelia was a little surprised that he went to her office, for she had come down to meet him, but Nanny quickly nudged her towards the entrance, so that she would go and meet him at last. But then, suddenly she stopped, and said that she understood everything perfectly well, of course, but wondered if the girl was really going to meet the prince in a knight's uniform. The girl waved her head and said that dresses don't suit her anyway. She didn't have any, so this was the most dressy and beautiful one she had. The nanny, upon reflection, said that it was indeed so. Then Ophelia changed the subject, asking the duke if the prince's room was ready. The man replied that of course it was already prepared, but then the maid suddenly asked why they needed separate rooms at all. They were to be married and sleep together. So she wondered what mistress thought about the shared bedroom, but seeing the look on her face, she immediately giggled. Ophelia, in turn, started yelling loudly, asking which shared bedroom we were talking about. After all, she had said she hadn't even met him once, and didn't want to embarrass him like this. The nanny wanted to insist, but the girl said that she could take care of things herself, and she should go and take care of the housework, for there must be a lot of it piling up. Then the girl turned back to the doors and even blushed with excitement. She knocked on them, and a man's voice said that the girl could come in. Ophelia immediately opened the door and bowed and introduced herself, saying that she was very pleased to meet His Highness Prince Aidan. The man stood with his back to her, and then, smiling, began to turn around slowly, saying that it was the silver heroine who had finally arrived after all. The girl, in order to worry less, even closed her eyes and looked down. When she heard his voice, she thought it was quite pleasant. He looked at her and told her to raise her head. When the girl looked him in the eye, he introduced himself and said he was very happy to meet her. Ophelia, when she saw his appearance, was all but embarrassed. She bowed again and thought that he was a real angel. She thought all men were muscle-covered animals with black beards, but the prince was more like a beautiful porcelain doll. All this time they just stood there in silence. The girl thought that the ladies would be jealous of her, and she felt ashamed of them for it. Hearing him cough, Ophelia realized that she wasn't doing a good thing. So she looked him in the eye and asked him for making him wait. He said there was nothing wrong with that and offered to sit down. Ophelia agreed and said he could make himself comfortable wherever he wanted. When they sat down across from each other, there was still a very awkward silence between them. The girl felt terrible, because she didn't even know what to talk to him about. Aidan said hesitatingly he had heard from His Majesty that ever since the academy he had liked her. Ophelia felt even more embarrassed and said it just happened. The girl herself at this point thought about what she was saying, which was just terribly embarrassing. However, the princess had asked her not to tell the truth, so she would just have to do it. So she quickly utters each word and closed her eyes, saying that of course she likes him. She knows she's not worthy of him, but her heart hasn't been able to forget him since the academy. When the guy heard this, he was also a bit surprised and assumed that she didn't choose him just to avoid marrying the king, but really had some feelings. The girl didn't even dare to look at him and said that she likes him as she has for years, and she apologizes for such a brazen request. However, she really wants him to marry her. Aidan saw her extend her hand to him and didn't know what to do. He wasn't going to shake it back. Once again there was such awkwardness between them. Ophelia suddenly realized that she had made a mistake in the form of a suggestion, as etiquette dictated that a man should do, and she had rushed in and made it herself. But he just smiled back. He thought about the fact that she should be ashamed to just stare at him like that. Ophelia stood up in turn. She was red and sweaty, but she apologized, saying that she didn't know much about lovemaking, so she might have made a lot of mistakes. The man tried to calm her down and told her that there was nothing wrong with it, because he still agreed and really wanted to marry her. After that, He took her hand and smiled. Ophelia, seeing such a sweet expression on his face, even held her breath for a while. But then suddenly he saw the surprised look on her face and asked what had happened, since everything had been fine just now. The girl, for her part, pulled her hand out and said it was nothing, for she was very glad he had agreed. She was already looking forward to their happy life together. Ophelia became very embarrassed, and she wondered if she had always been so weak on people's appearances. As soon as she saw the prince's appearance, she even lost the power of speech for a while, which was not typical of her. She, smiling, also said that she really hoped they could get along and find common ground. Aiden stared at her in surprise for a while. Then he said he hoped so too. Then the girl, bowing, offered to show him his room and told him to follow her. The man did not object. Soon they were walking through the corridors, and through the windows they could already see the sun beginning to set over the horizon. The nanny also accompanied the two of them to show them where the master would spend the night. Ophelia walked behind, and turning to the prince, apologized that the place was not as luxurious as his palace. She also said that the missing furnishings he would be able to procure to his liking, and it would not be a problem if they did not fit the design. At that moment, Aiden went to the window and opened it, breathing in the fresh street air. Then he turned to the girl and said that it was all right. That would be enough for him. But then suddenly he lowered his head and wondered if the time had not yet come for their shared bedroom, for he had thought they would live together at once. When the girl heard this, she was so much surprised that she couldn't even say anything, and Nanny, who was standing there eavesdropping on the whole thing, thought about not listening to Mistress and actually preparing the common bedroom. But at that moment, the prince suddenly laughed and said that he just wasn't sure about the appropriateness of separate rooms, since they would be married very soon anyway. Ophelia was a little indignant, but she could not say anything against him, for then the truth would be revealed. At this point, the nanny came running into their room and told them that this was all temporary until they got married. Then, of course, they would both move into the shared bedroom. The girl immediately turned to the nanny, telling her not to make any hasty decisions. Then she explained in a whisper that they would live in separate rooms until the divorce. The nanny, hearing this, looked at Madame in surprise and asked her what she could possibly be talking about. How could she think of divorce before she was even married? But Ophelia started to push her and told her she had to go. The nanny resisted, but she did not succeed, and the girl simply closed the door behind her. Then she turned to her future fiancé again, and coughing, finally thought of something to say to him. The girl replied that they knew absolutely nothing about each other yet, so she thought it was better to live in separate rooms for the time being for their own convenience. Aiden, hearing this, immediately understood everything, and wondered if she really wanted to start a relationship already married, and thought it was pretty smart to do so. The girl, hearing this, was a little confused, but then said that in principle it could be called that. He was satisfied with that answer. Then the man asked when they were going to get married. The man asked her when they were going to get married, which took her by surprise, because she wanted to delay it as long as possible. But smiling nervously, she said they could do it as soon as he wished. Aiden said, hesitating, that in that case he thought a week from now would be acceptable. The girl replied that in that case she would have everything ready by that date. Also smiling, she said that he must be very tired from the road, so he should rest properly. The man thanked her heartily for her hospitality and all, and smiled goodbye. And Ophelia, before she left, bowed and said that she would have the dinner brought directly to his room, and now she would go off to do other things. Sabum. As soon as the girl was out the door, she immediately sat down and couldn't believe that this was all really happening. She was incredibly ashamed and embarrassed, and she had never felt this way before. She tried to get to her feet and thought about the fact that the prince was incredibly handsome, that it took her breath away just looking at him, so she had to be very careful not to lose her head and always be on her guard. The girl went to her chambers and thought about what had happened. She was alarmed by his strange smile. She was dazzlingly beautiful, but it felt like it was just a mask that hid something more. But Ophelia pushed those musings aside indefinitely, for she assumed that most likely he was just very uncomfortable too, which was why it was like this. At that moment, the prince unbuttoned the top of his shirt and collapsed on the bed. He could not believe that he should somehow seduce this woman and then make a child with her. Aiden was simply furious, for he can't defy the king's will. However, he too had his own preferences in which he wished to adhere to. But unfortunately, Ophelia didn't exactly fit the bill, and given her line of work, he assumed that she'd probably never even been in a relationship. She had been in the service for quite a long time, so she hardly found time for amusements with various aristocrats. It was very hard for him to believe that this woman could actually like him, so much so, and for so many years. Aiden thought then that there was certainly some genuine sympathy for him in her actions, but most of it was fake. He suddenly laughed and didn't understand why she had even said she liked him in the first place. In fact, he was even ashamed now. But then the guy realized he had the wrong thing to worry about. If he wanted to survive, he had no other choice. When night came, the overhead lights had already been turned out in the manor, and it was quite dark. She was in her study and came out for a while, looking through some papers. But at that moment, the nanny suddenly started coming to meet her with a cart full of stuff. As soon as she was near the mistress, the girl wondered if His Highness had refused dinner. The wagon was completely filled with dishes. The nanny replied in a sad voice that, "That's right, you see. He said he had a treat on the road, so he didn't feel like eating. But he asked for tea, so she is following him." Ophelia was a little interested in this, but said she understood and let the maid go on with her duties. Then the girl suddenly walked quickly to her room without anyone noticing her, and closing the door behind her, she was finally able to exhale with relief for the whole day. She really hoped that she hadn't fallen for him because of some looks, but the girl quickly dismissed those thoughts, assuming that she simply wasn't immune to such handsome men, since her squad was filled with the same men she was already used to. The girl knew that falling in love with a pretty face was definitely not in her nature. She changed into her pajamas, thinking that it would be much better to think about this situation in the morning. So Ophelia lay down on the bed and immediately closed her eyes, hoping that she would be able to sleep. After a few minutes, however, she turned over on her other side and heard the strange sounds again. When she couldn't stand it, she sat up on the bed, ready to scream loudly. She was annoyed with her heart, which was beating so hard after what had happened. She really wanted it to finally calm down and let her sleep. The girl lay down quite late, for she had a lot of thoughts and worries in her head, so it was hard for her to fall asleep. Well, when morning came, she went down to have breakfast. The girl was in a very good mood, even though she hadn't gotten much sleep. Ophelia went straight into the kitchen, said with a smile on her face that she had been smelling the aroma of bread since morning, and noticed that the baked goods from Marka were as always top-notch. But at that moment Aiden, who was already dressed for breakfast, turned to her and smiled, wishing the girl a good morning. When she saw him, she was a little surprised, and then at once remembered that the prince had arrived last night, that she had forgotten all about it. Then in a menacing voice, frightened, Nanny turned to her and asked what was the matter with her clothes. Ophelia got a little uncomfortable and said that she had completely forgotten that they now had a guest living with them, and needed to change clothes all the time. The maid led her out the door and told her that there was no way she could forget about this, so she needed to go and change quickly. Some time had passed since then. The maid was just helping the girl to tie her shirt, and the prince, knocking at her room, said she needed to eat. Ophelia immediately turned to his side and said, embarrassed, that she had suddenly remembered that she had to go somewhere urgently in the morning, so she unfortunately couldn't stay late for breakfast with them. The nanny, in turn, hearing this, was very surprised, but at that moment Ophelia turned to the butler Kevin and asked that he harness her horse. Aiden was suddenly wary, and then wondered to his future spouse where she was going first thing in the morning, without even eating breakfast. Ophelia laughed nervously and said that she just had an urgent matter to attend to, so she had to put everything else aside and go there right away. The man continued to smile, and he realized that she was acting differently for the morning. So he came closer to her and began to tuck her hair behind her ear, a small but intimate gesture. The girl immediately felt very uncomfortable, so she moved away from him and told him not to worry, he would be fine. Ophelia also said that she would be back very soon, and while she was gone, the butler would show him around the estate so he could get his bearings. Aiden was a little surprised at this reaction, however she said that he didn't mind it. Then the girl said goodbye to him and went outside, while the man stayed in the palace. The girl at once put on her cloak and climbed on her horse, and then rushed straight from the palace. Unfortunately, Ophelia was never able to get used to it. For the morning she saw it, she was again at a loss for words, for it shines only brighter every day. And after a while, the girl arrived at the estate where her best friend Regina lives. Yes, for her part, had only recently woken up, so she was still in her nightgown. She looked at Ophelia in surprise, not sure what she was even doing. They were silent for a while, and then Regina wondered why she had come so suddenly. They had agreed to meet for lunch, and what was wrong with her face in general. The girl straightway all trembling, and then said she had come so quickly for friendly advice. A friend, hearing this, was very surprised and asked why she suddenly decided, because even from a very young age, she did not like to talk about herself. But then suddenly Regina got up from her seat and said that in that case she would go and change, since it wasn't as urgent as she thought. Ophelia didn't object, and the girl left, humming a tune to herself. She thought about the fact that she could tell when Regina was having a good time at night, and now was just such an occasion. At that moment, some man suddenly came in and asked Ophelia if she would like some tea. He was dark-haired and bowing, greeted the girl. Ophelia, when she saw him, immediately realized that he was perfect for Regina's taste, and assumed that he was the new toy she was talking about. There was an awkward silence between them. Then the girl said that the princess was quite nice to him, since he could enter the various rooms so freely. The man didn't understand what she was talking about at first, and Ophelia in turn said that he was just as handsome as the rest of them. The boy was too embarrassed and said that she was exaggerating. At this moment, Ophelia thought about the fact that he was really good-looking. However, he did not evoke any awe, unlike Prince Aidan. Karina suddenly came out and turned to the man and told him to stop flirting with her friend, and also told Chester that he was already single. The man was suddenly wary and moved closer to his girlfriend, wondering when he had ever flirted in the first place. Regina smiled and wondered what he was doing right now. Ophelia immediately turned away from them, thinking that this was getting a little out of line. They were friends, of course, but she thought that was unacceptable. Karina talked to her lover for a while longer, and Chester in turn, blushing even more, turned away and said that in that case he would wait for her outside. As he walked out the door, her friend looked at her angrily and said that she had asked her more than once to refrain from doing that in front of her. But Regina laughed and said that she knew she loved those things, so there was no way she could stop in time. Then she decided to get to the point and asked Ophelia why she had rushed to her vulgar friend's house so early. Then Ophelia immediately remembered her troubles and, blushing heavily, said that she felt like she had fallen in love at first sight. When Regina heard this, she froze for a while and stared at the girl in surprise, unable to believe her words. Ophelia blushed even more, and decided to explain to her in more detail, telling her that she apparently had a crush on her brother. Regina suddenly laughed and asked, "Is it really fait accompli?" She was very glad that she had finally waited for the day when Ophelia came to her for love advice. She was beginning to feel even more proud of herself. Continuing to smile, the girl asked that she tell everything in detail, and asked if it was true that as soon as she saw his face, her heart almost jumped out of her chest. The girl turned away from her and said that it must have really happened, because she still couldn't sleep afterward because of that strong heartbeat. Regina stepped closer to her and asked, "What else was there for sure?" She blushed like a cancer. Ophelia, hearing all this, was very indignant and said that she must be very amused. Regina continued to smile, and then said that she could not be otherwise her friend, who, as it seemed to her in her whole life, will not look at a man fell in love at first sight. So also in her brother. And not so long ago, someone told her that all that matters in a man is his sincerity, and looks are not the most important factor. Ophelia sighed heavily and told the girl to stop bullying, because she was having a hard time herself, and she didn't even know what to do. She can't exactly dive headfirst into this maelstrom. When Regina heard about it, she was very surprised and asked why she suddenly couldn't. The girl explained that it was because they already had a lot to do. They had a lot of work to do. And then she stepped closer and said in a quiet voice that she meant their coup de grace. Regina smiled at that moment and thought about how incredibly sweet she was after all, even when they were trying to change the subject. Then the girl ran her finger down her cheek and said that they had ruled at the same time. When she heard this, Ophelia was very surprised and asked what she meant. Her friend explained that you can take her for example. She tried to succeed in love and fun, and even in preparing for the coup, and she succeeded in everything. So she just doesn't understand why you have to separate them all if you can do them all at the same time. But Ophelia suddenly put her head down and said that very soon there would be serious changes, and if she lost her head over some man, it might hurt all their plans. Regina then rolled her eyes and told them to immediately see that she's never been in a relationship, so she doesn't even know how things work there. The girl said that she certainly did. However, she still stuck to her opinion. In fact, she only touched the man's hand when the instructor was teaching her how to wield a sword. But also when she fell, Leopold would reach out his hand to help her. However, in fact, in all her years, Ophelia had never once kissed or spent passionate nights with anyone. And only now the girl realized that she had an incredibly boring life. Regina in turn put a hand on her shoulder and told her that only fools lose their heads to love so much that it hurts their business. And she thinks her friend is definitely not one of those people. She also said that she had affairs with many men. However, Ophelia has never seen her other tasks fail because of this. So Regina advised her not to dwell on her inner struggle and to behave in a way that she wouldn't regret. She just doesn't need to resist this love. Ophelia hesitated a little and became incredibly sad. And then she asked her friend, "Is it possible to act like this?" She said it's actually different for everyone, but in general terms, it's definitely possible. Regina also added that she wasn't worried about her, because I had known her for years. And then she asked her friend if she thought she was so reckless as to let her life go down the drain because of a man. The girl in turn said of course not, but still she had her concerns. Regina interrupted her and told her that the most important thing was to seize the moment. What coup and love had in common was that the slightest delay could ruin everything, and she could have both without even trying. Ophelia felt a little better after her friend's advice, and she said she understood. Then she wondered if it was okay that she liked her brother. Regina sat down at the table and took a cup of tea, wondering what the problem might be. They just need to be very careful in order not to make big trouble, or rather, small and screaming. When the girl heard this, she became very indignant and even blushed, asking her friend what she was even saying. But Regina, smiling, wondered what the girl was going to do in general if she suddenly got pregnant. After all, that is actually the biggest possible problem, so she would definitely need to watch it carefully. Ophelia didn't like this conversation anymore, so she asked her friend not to say such stupid things. They weren't even holding hands yet, so they wouldn't be in danger of that anytime soon. But Regina suddenly wondered how she was going to make it through her wedding night. She'd thought she'd taken that into account when she'd agreed to get married. Her friend immediately started screaming excuses and said that they needed to get to know each other first. She didn't even like Prince Aidan, so a wedding night was out of the question. Regina suddenly laughed and said that, actually, Chester wasn't bothered by it at all. Ophelia in turn was ready to settle down and asked that her friend stop talking about it already, because she didn't want to know about her night at all. The girl laughed and said she understood, and wouldn't tease her about it again. Then, as she poured tea for her friend, she asked how Aidan was settling in. Ophelia sighed heavily and said that things weren't really going well, and Regina thought about how it was all because she wasn't expressing her emotions at all. So the girl wondered if maybe he was just being cautious, because after all, he had been bullied by his older brother as a child, and now it might be hard for him to trust people. In fact, as a child, Regina lived in the Academy's dormitory from an early age, and after graduation, she left the kingdom for the palace forever, not wanting to stay there for a single day. They only saw Aidan a few times a year, but nevertheless, Regina was constantly secretly sending a special person over to her brother's house to see how he was doing in general, so she didn't put him off at all. Ophelia turned to the girl and said that it was quite surprising, for Prince Aidan was quite smiling, polite, and very handsome. When she said the last word, she immediately became embarrassed and replied that she didn't mean it at all. Regina, however, paid no attention to it. She realized that even a fae for her was sometimes confusing, but that was normal, because she'd only seen brutal men on the battlefield, and Aidan was like an alien to her. The girl told her friend in a sad voice that it was as if he wore a mask all the time, and that the king must have ordered him to do something, since he behaved like that. Regina suddenly wondered why she thought that. Then Ophelia said that a man who was willing to make her queen just to control her would definitely not give her a prince for pretty eyes, and would do everything he could to twist it in his direction. The girl suddenly thought about it and said that it was really true. There was no way I could trust Aiden completely, because he would go to absolutely anything just to survive. Ophelia asked in surprise, did she really think so? And the girl asked, did she think that someone who grew up under the king's oppression could be different? The girls were silent for a while. Then Regina said that she had to take very good care of the documents. Ophelia replied that she had already hidden everything. Everything that was important was long gone. Her friend praised her and said she was doing the right thing. Ophelia sighed and said she was much calmer now, and then offered to discuss their coup. Regina suddenly laughed and said that she had thought that the girl had completely forgotten about it because of her love worries.